Her dark brown eyes, usually warm and expressive, now held the dull glint of exhaustion as she stared at her phone screen. 3 missed calls from her landlord, 2 overdraft notifications, and a reminder that her student loan payment was due in 48 hours. $637. The number burned in her mind like a brand. She absently reached for the small prescription bottle in her purse. The familiar rattle of sertralina tablets, a comfort she'd grown to depend on. The anxiety medication helped, but it couldn't pay bills, or make Wagner Elias Bosch any less impossible to work with. "Coleman!" His voice cut through the office like a blade, sharp and commanding. "My office. Now!" Rosie's fingers instinctively moved to her mouth, a nervous habit she'd been fighting since law school. She caught herself before biting her nail and smoothed down her navy blazer instead. The gold earrings her sister had given her for graduation caught the light as she stood, a small reminder of the dreams she'd had when she first walked through these doors 6 months ago. Wagner's corner office felt more like a courtroom than a workspace. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Richmond, and his imposing figure stood silhouetted against the afternoon sky. At 35, he commanded attention without trying. 6 feet 3 inches of controlled authority, his hair cropped military short, steel blue eyes that seemed to dissect everything they encountered. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, not a thread out of place, unlike the chaos Rosie felt brewing inside her chest. "The Henderson contract," he said without preamble, not bothering to look up from the papers scattered across his mahogany desk. 3 errors in the liability clause alone. This is unacceptable. Rosie felt her pulse quicken. "I can fix those by—" "This isn't about fixing." His eyes finally met hers, and she felt that familiar tightness in her throat. "This is about precision. About understanding that in this business, mistakes don't just cost money. They destroy reputations." "Your reputation," she thought bitterly, "while I'm drowning in debt trying to prove I belong here. I understand, Mr. Bosch. It won't happen again." "See that it doesn't." He turned back to his computer, effectively dismissing her. "And Coleman, the Morrison deposition prep needs to be flawless. We can't afford any more oversights." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Rosie nodded stiffly and turned to leave, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood. As she reached for the door handle, Wagner's voice stopped her. "One more thing. I need you to stay late tonight. The depositions are tomorrow, and frankly, I don't trust your current work to hold up under scrutiny." Something inside Rosie snapped. Not visibly, she'd learned to keep her composure in front of Wagner, but something deep and essential cracked like ice under pressure. She managed a professional nod and closed the door behind her with careful control. Back at her desk, Rosie stared at her reflection in her phone's black screen. Her elegant bun was still perfectly in place, her makeup professional and understated, but behind her dark eyes, a storm was brewing. The office was nearly empty now, just the night cleaning crew and the occasional associate burning the midnight oil. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, switching to video mode. Her finger hovered over the record button for a long moment before she pressed it. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to the camera, her voice barely audible but thick with exhaustion. "He thinks he can just control everything, every breath, every thought, every minute of my life." Her voice grew stronger, more defiant. "Wagner Bosch doesn't know what it's like to choose between groceries and gas money. He doesn't know what it's like to smile and nod while someone tears apart your work like it's nothing." The words poured out of her, months of frustration, fear, and fury condensed into 3 raw minutes of truth. She talked about the sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the way Wagner's criticism felt like paper cuts that never quite healed. "He acts like he's doing me some kind of favor by letting me work here, but I earned this. I worked 2 jobs through law school, graduated summa cum laude, and I'm still not good enough for His Royal Highness." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Well, guess what? I'm done pretending this is okay." When she finally stopped recording, her hands were shaking slightly. The video sat there on her phone like a loaded gun, dangerous and cathartic all at once. She felt lighter somehow, as if speaking her truth to the camera had released some of the poison that had been building in her system. Her phone buzzed with a text from Naya. "Girl, you still at that place? It's almost 9 p.m. Rosie smiled for the first time all day and quickly typed back, "Just finished something important. Heading home soon." She gathered her papers and closed her laptop, then walked to Wagner's office to drop off the corrected Henderson contract. His door was slightly ajar, the room dark except for the glow of his computer screen. She could see him hunched over his desk, still working despite the late hour. For a moment, something almost like sympathy flickered in her chest. Wagner might be impossible, but he was as trapped in this building as she was, chasing the same. The impossible standards he set for everyone else. She slipped the contract onto his desk quietly, not wanting to disturb him. As she turned to leave, her phone slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She froze, waiting for Wagner to look up, but he remained focused on his screen, apparently lost in thought. Rosie bent to retrieve her phone, then stood and hurried out of the office. It wasn't until she was in the elevator, descending toward the parking garage, that she realized something was wrong. She patted her pockets, checked her purse twice, and felt her stomach drop. Her phone, the phone with the video, wasn't in her hands. She turned back toward the elevator buttons, but the doors had already closed and the floor indicator showed they were passing the 3rd floor. By the time she could get back upstairs, Wagner might have already found it, might have already seen the video. Standing alone in the parking garage, surrounded by shadows and the echo of her own panicked breathing, Rosie Amara Coleman realized that in 3 minutes of honest emotion, she might have just destroyed everything she'd worked so hard to build. The night air was cold against her face as she walked to her car, but inside her chest, something burned hot and bright, fear mixed with a strange sense of freedom. What had she done? Wagner Elias Bosch didn't notice the phone at first. The sleek device lay face down on the edge of his mahogany desk, camouflaged among the scattered contracts and legal briefs that had consumed his evening. He'd been staring at the Morrison case, files for the past hour, his steel blue eyes burning from the computer screen's harsh glow, when the soft buzz of an incoming notification finally caught his attention. He glanced at the unfamiliar phone, then at his watch, 9:47 p.m. The building was tomb quiet now. Even the cleaning crew had finished their rounds. Wagner's own iPhone sat charging beside his laptop, silent and ignored as usual. He rarely bothered with personal calls these days. The phone buzzed again, lighting up with a text preview. "Nia, girl, please tell me you made it home safe." "That boss of yours." Wagner's jaw tightened. He recognized the phone now, the rose gold case with a small crack near the camera, the way it had slipped from Rosie Coleman's hands earlier. She must have been more rattled by their conversation than she'd let on. He reached for the device, intending to power it down and return it tomorrow morning, but the screen came alive at his touch. The camera app was still open, showing a paused video with Rosie's face frozen in the preview frame. Her dark eyes looked different in the recording, vulnerable, unguarded in a way he'd never seen during their professional interactions. Wagner's finger hesitated over the home button. This was private, clearly accidental. The right thing would be to close the app, maybe send Rosie a text from his own phone letting her know she'd left it behind. But something in her expression held him captive. The careful composure she wore, like armor in his office, was nowhere to be found. This was Rosie, raw and unfiltered, and against every instinct of propriety he'd cultivated over 35 years, Wagner found himself pressing play. "I can't do this anymore," her voice whispered from the tiny speakers, and Wagner felt something shift uncomfortably in his chest. He listened, transfixed, as months of accumulated frustration poured out of the woman he thought he knew. Every criticism he'd delivered, every impossible deadline he'd set, every moment he'd pushed her harder because he saw potential she didn't even recognize in herself, all of it had been building to this breaking point. Wagner Bosch doesn't know what it's like to choose between groceries and gas money. The words hit him like a physical blow. He set the phone down abruptly, his hands suddenly unsteady. In the reflection of his darkened office window, he saw himself clearly. A man in a $3,000 suit sitting in a corner office, completely disconnected from the reality of the people working under him. When had he become this person? When had success made him so blind to suffering that was happening 3 doors down from his own office. Wagner picked up the phone again, forcing himself to watch the rest. He saw the way Rosie's hands trembled slightly as she spoke, the exhaustion that ran deeper than long hours or difficult cases. He saw a brilliant woman drowning and realized with stunning clarity that he'd been the one holding her underwater. "I'm done pretending this is okay." The video ended, leaving Wagner staring at his own reflection in the black screen. The silence in his office felt suffocating, pregnant with truths he'd been too arrogant or too scared to acknowledge. His first instinct was damage control. Classic Wagner Bosch, always thinking 3 moves ahead. If this video got out, if other employees saw it, it could be a PR nightmare. The company's reputation, his own standing in the legal community, everything he'd built could crumble from one moment of honest emotion caught on camera. But underneath the executive's calculating mind, something else stirred. Something that had been dormant for so long he'd almost forgotten it existed. Guilt. Wagner stood and moved to his window, looking out at the city lights scattered like stars across the Richmond skyline. Somewhere out there, Rosie was probably panicking, wondering if her career was over, if her moment of vulnerability would cost her everything she'd worked for. He thought about her in his office earlier that evening, the way she'd held herself, so perfectly straight. Despite the exhaustion in her eyes, the professional mask never slipping even when he'd delivered his harshest criticism. How had he missed the signs? How had he become so focused on results that he'd forgotten the human cost? His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed his brother's name, but Wagner let it go to voicemail. He wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine, wasn't ready to slip back into the comfortable numbness that had become his default setting. Instead, he found himself thinking about Rosie's voice on the recording, not the words themselves, but the tone. Beneath the anger and frustration, he'd heard something else. Intelligence, passion, the kind of fierce dedication that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with law in the first place, back when justice had felt like something worth fighting. For instead of just another billable hour, Wagner walked back to his desk and picked up the Henderson contract she'd corrected. Her handwriting in the margins was precise, elegant, but more than that, her suggested changes were actually improvements, real improvements that would strengthen their client's position significantly. When was the last time he'd acknowledged good work instead of just pointing out flaws? When was the last time he'd offered guidance instead of criticism? He opened his laptop and began typing an email, then stopped. Everything he wrote sounded hollow, corporate, exactly the kind of meaningless apology that would confirm every harsh word she'd spoken in that video. Wagner deleted the draft and tried again. And again. By the time he gave up, it was past midnight, and his wastebasket was full of crumpled printouts, failed attempts to find words that could bridge the chasm he'd spent months creating. He locked Rosie's phone in his desk drawer, knowing she'd be desperate to get it back, knowing the video it contained could destroy both their careers if it fell into the wrong hands. But for the first time in years, Wagner Elias Bosch wasn't thinking like an executive protecting his interests. He was thinking like a man who'd just been shown a mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back at him. The cleaning crew's vacuum hummed somewhere in the distance as Wagner finally gathered his things to leave. Tomorrow he would have to face Rosie, would have to navigate the impossible conversation that video had made inevitable. But tonight, driving home through empty streets in his pristine BMW, all Wagner could hear was her voice saying the words that had shattered his carefully constructed world. "I'm done pretending this is okay." And for the first time since he could remember, Wagner Elias Bosch wasn't sure if anything in his life actually was. Rosie had been awake since 4:17 a.m. She knew the exact time because she'd been staring at her alarm clock, watching the red digits mock her with each passing minute. Her small studio apartment felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing in like her mounting anxiety. The prescription bottle on her nightstand remained untouched. She needed to feel everything clearly today, needed her mind sharp for whatever battle was coming. By 6 a.m. she'd already showered twice, changed outfits 3 times, and rehearsed her resignation speech in the bathroom mirror until the words felt hollow in her mouth. Her reflection stared back at her. Professional blazer, perfectly pressed, hair pulled into a sleek bun, gold earrings catching the early morning light streaming through her single window. She looked ready for court, but inside she felt like she was walking toward her own execution. The commute to Morrison and Associates usually took 35 minutes on the metro. But today, Rosie found herself standing on the platform 20 minutes. Early? Her hands trembling slightly as she gripped her coffee cup. The bitter liquid had gone cold an hour ago, but she held onto it like a lifeline. He's probably already seen it, she thought, watching the train approach through the tunnel's darkness. Probably called security, HR, maybe even the Virginia State. Her phone, her lifeline to the world, was sitting on Wagner's desk like a ticking bomb. Every secret, every photo, every private message was trapped in that device, but more importantly, that video was there. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of career suicide, recorded in a moment of exhaustion and frustration. The office lobby felt different when she arrived at 7:30 a.m. The familiar marble floors and glass elevators that had once filled her with pride now seemed like the entrance to a courthouse where she was both defendant and victim. Janet, the security guard, smiled her usual warm greeting, but Rosie could barely manage a nod in response. She doesn't know yet, Rosie realized. Nobody knows yet. The elevator ride to the 15th floor felt endless. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a composed professional, but Rosie could see the truth in her own dark eyes. Pure, crystallized terror. The hallway to her desk stretched like a gauntlet. Wagner's office door was closed, but she could see the light underneath, meaning he was already there, already waiting. Rosie set her purse down at her desk with deliberate care, her movements precise and controlled. She could feel eyes on her, other associates arriving early, preparing for their own battles in the legal war that never ended. Did they know? Had Wagner already started making calls? Rough night? The voice belonged to Troy Mackenzie, a third-year associate who'd started the same week as Rosie. His sandy hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, his smile friendly but curious. Something like that, Rosie managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Wagner's been in there since I got here at 7, Troy continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Looked like he didn't sleep much either. You two working on something? Big? You could say that, Rosie thought, but she just shrugged and turned to her computer. The screensaver demanded her password, but her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. What was the point of logging in if she'd be escorted out by lunch? Coleman. Wagner's voice cut through the morning bustle like a blade. Every head in the vicinity turned toward his office door, where he stood silhouetted against the morning light streaming through his windows. His usually immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of stress, his tie slightly looser than normal, a shadow of stubble he'd missed while shaving. My office. Now. The walk across the floor felt like crossing a minefield. Rosie kept her chin up, her stride confident, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the weight of curious stares, the subtle shift in energy that meant office gossip was already beginning to percolate. Wagner's office smelled like coffee and expensive cologne, familiar scents that now carried an undertone of dread. He closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a verdict being sealed. Sit, he said quietly. Rosie remained standing. If this was going to be her execution, she'd face it on her feet. Wagner moved to his desk, and Rosie's breath caught in her throat. There, sitting next to his laptop like an accusation, was her phone. The rose gold case caught the morning light, and she could see the small crack near the camera that she'd been meaning to fix for months. I believe this belongs to you, Wagner said, his voice carefully neutral. Rosie stepped forward and reached for the device, but Wagner's hand closed over it first. Their fingers brushed for just a moment, his warm and slightly rough, hers cold with fear, before he pulled the phone back. Before you take it, he continued, his steel blue eyes meeting. Hers directly. We need to talk. Mr. Bosch, I can explain. Can you? He moved around the desk, stopping just close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, the way his usually perfect composure had developed hairline cracks. Because I've been trying to understand since last night, and I'm not sure explanation is what's needed here. Rosie's prepared speech evaporated. This wasn't the Wagner she knew, the cold, demanding perfectionist who treated her like an obstacle to overcome. This man looked human, uncertain, maybe even vulnerable. I watched it, Rosie. Her name on his lips sounded different somehow, softer, more personal than the clipped Coleman she'd grown accustomed to. The video. I watched all of it. The admission hung between them like a live wire. Rosie felt her carefully constructed defenses crumble, leaving her exposed in a way that felt more intimate than nakedness. "I didn't mean for you to see that," she whispered. "I know." Wagner set her phone on the desk between them, but made no move to push it toward her. "The question is, what do we do now?" Rosie stared at him, searching his face for signs of the storm she'd expected. The anger, the disappointment, the cold dismissal that would end her career before it had truly begun. Instead, she saw something. That terrified her more than any executive rage ever could. She saw understanding. "Are you going to fire me?" The words came out smaller than she'd intended. Wagner was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to the window overlooking the city, then back again. "Is that what you want?" The question caught her completely off guard. "What? In the video you said you were done pretending this was okay. So I'm asking, do you want to leave?" Rosie opened her mouth to give the safe answer, the professional response that would preserve what little dignity she had left. But something in Wagner's expression stopped her. For the first time since she'd started working at Morrison & Associates, she felt like he was actually listening. Not judging, not calculating, just listening. "I don't know," she admitted, the honesty feeling dangerous and liberating all at once. Wagner nodded slowly, as if her uncertainty made perfect sense to him. "Then maybe," he said quietly, "we should figure that out together." The words settled between them like a peace treaty neither of them had expected to sign, and Rosie realized that whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The coffee in Rosie's hands had gone cold again, but she didn't notice. 3 hours had passed since Wagner's unexpected proposition, and she was still trying to process what figuring it out together actually meant. She'd returned to her desk in a daze, mechanically responding to emails and reviewing contracts, while her mind replayed their conversation on an endless loop. Her phone sat beside her keyboard now, fully charged, and betraying no signs of the chaos it had caused. But every time it buzzed with a notification, Rosie's heart skipped a beat, wondering if Wagner had changed his mind, if HR was calling, if her brief reprieve was over. Around her, the office hummed with its usual Tuesday morning energy. Paralegals shuttled between floors with armloads of documents. Junior associates hunched over laptops nursing their third cups of coffee, and partners swept through the hallways like sharks sensing blood in the water. It was the same environment she'd navigated for months, but somehow everything felt different now. "You're overthinking this," she told herself, fingers absently moving toward her mouth before she caught herself and reached for her stress ball instead. The small foam sphere had been a gift from Nia, bright purple with Boss Lady printed in gold letters, and squeezing it helped channel the nervous energy that threatened to consume her. Earth to Rosie. She looked up to find Troy Mackenzie standing beside her desk, his expression curious and slightly concerned. His tie was already loosened despite the early hour, a sure sign he'd been buried in the Hartwell merger since dawn. "You okay? You've been staring at that same paragraph for like 10 minutes. Rosie glanced at her computer screen and realized he was right. The Morrison deposition prep, the very document that had triggered last night's breakdown, sat open but unread, her cursor blinking mockingly at the end of a sentence she couldn't remember starting. "Just trying to get this perfect," she said, forcing a smile. "You know how Mr. Bosch is about details." Troy grimaced sympathetically. "Tell me about it. He eviscerated my contract review yesterday. I swear the man sees typos that don't even exist. Yet—" He paused, studying her face more carefully. "Speaking of which, what was that whole closed-door meeting about this morning? You looked like you were walking to your own funeral." Before Rosie could answer, a familiar voice cut through the office chatter. "Mackenzie, don't you have billable hours to worry about?" Wagner appeared behind Troy like a storm cloud, his presence immediately shifting the energy around Rosie's desk. But there was something different about him too, a subtle softness around the edges that hadn't been there yesterday. "Of course, Mr. Bosch, just checking on the Morrison prep." Troy practically sprinted back to his own desk, leaving Rosie alone. With the man who held her career in his hands, Wagner moved closer, close enough that she caught a hint of his cologne, something expensive and understated that suited him perfectly. He placed a stack of files on her desk with careful precision. "The Kellerman case," he said, his voice low enough that nearby colleagues couldn't overhear. "I need a fresh perspective on their liability exposure." Rosie looked up at him, searching, his face for hidden meaning. The Kellerman case was high profile, exactly the kind of assignment that could make or break a junior associate's reputation. Was this a peace offering, a test, or simply business as usual with a man who was apparently full of surprises? "I'll have something for you by end of day," she said carefully. "Actually," Wagner paused, seeming to choose his words with unusual care, "I was thinking we could discuss it over lunch, away from the office. There's a cafe on Broad Street that serves decent sandwiches and has the added benefit of actual privacy." The invitation hung in the air between them like an unexploded bomb. In 6 months of working at Morrison & Associates, Rosie had never seen Wagner eat lunch anywhere but his office, never seen him engage in anything remotely resembling casual conversation with an employee. "Is that appropriate?" she asked, immediately hating how uncertain her voice sounded. Wagner's expression shifted slightly, and for a moment she saw something that looked almost like hurt flash across his steel blue eyes. "If you'd prefer to stick to conference rooms and formal meetings, I understand," he said quietly. "I'm still learning how to do this, how to be better than what I've been." The honesty in his admission hit Rosie like a physical blow. This wasn't the Wagner Bosch who'd terrorized her for months with impossible standards and cutting criticism. This was a man admitting he'd been wrong, asking for a chance to make things right. "Okay," she heard herself saying. "Lunch sounds good." The smile that crossed Wagner's face was small but genuine, transforming his entire expression in a way that made Rosie's pulse quicken for reasons that had nothing to do with anxiety. 12:30, he asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice, to remain steady. After Wagner disappeared back into his office, Rosie found herself staring at the Kellerman files without really seeing them. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nia. "How's the damage control going? Still employed?" Rosie typed back quickly. "Still here. Having lunch with him to discuss a case." The response came within seconds. "Lunch? Girl, what kind of case requires lunch?" "Good." Question, Rosie thought, but she didn't have an answer. Nothing about this situation made sense according to the rules she thought she understood. Wagner Bosch didn't do lunch meetings with junior associates. Wagner Bosch didn't admit to being wrong. Wagner Bosch definitely didn't look at her the way he had this morning, like she was a person rather than just another piece of office equipment. She opened the first Kellerman file and tried to focus on the liability issues, but her mind kept drifting to the way Wagner had said her name earlier. Rosie. Not Coleman, not Ms. Coleman, just Rosie, like they were equals, like they were something. "Don't go there," she warned herself. "He's still your boss. This is still your job." Don't read more into it than what it is. But even as she tried to maintain professional distance, Rosie couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something vast and unexplored. The video had torn down walls between them, exposing truths that couldn't be taken back or ignored. At 12:25, she found herself in the bathroom, checking her reflection one more time. Her blazer was wrinkle-free, her hair still perfectly arranged, her makeup professional but not overdone. She looked like exactly what she was, a competent young lawyer ready for a business lunch. So why did her reflection seem to be asking a question she wasn't ready to answer? Walking toward the elevator to meet Wagner, Rosie felt like she was crossing into uncharted territory where the old rules no longer applied. She had no map for this journey, no precedent to follow. All she had was the memory of Wagner's eyes when he'd asked if she wanted to figure things out together, and the dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't walking this path alone. The elevator doors opened, revealing Wagner waiting inside, and Rosie stepped forward into whatever came next. The cafe on Broad Street was nothing like what Rosie had expected. Instead of the sterile corporate atmosphere she'd imagined Wagner would choose, Magnolia's kitchen was warm and inviting, with exposed brick walls, mismatched vintage chairs, and the kind of authentic southern charm that reminded her of her grandmother's house in Norfolk. The lunch crowd was an eclectic mix of VCU students, local artists, and downtown professionals, creating a pleasant hum of conversation that provided perfect cover for whatever this meeting was supposed to be. Wagner had arrived first, a fact that surprised Rosie more than it should have. She spotted him immediately, sitting at a corner table near the window, his usually pristine appearance slightly more relaxed. He'd removed his suit jacket and loosened his tie, and the afternoon, sunlight streaming through the glass, softened the sharp angles of his face in a way that made him look younger, more approachable, more human. "Sorry I'm late," Rosie said as she approached, though she wasn't actually late. She'd spent 10 minutes in her car in the parking lot, trying to calm her nerves and remind herself that this was just a business lunch, nothing more. "You're not late," Wagner replied, standing to pull out her chair, a gesture that caught her completely off guard. "I just arrived early." Old habit. As Rosie settled into her seat, she caught a whiff of the cafe's signature scent, fresh bread, coffee, and something that might have been cinnamon. It was comforting in a way that made her shoulders relax despite herself. "I've never been here before," she admitted, scanning the handwritten menu board above the counter. "It's nice. My brother introduced me to this place about 2 years ago," Wagner said, following her gaze. "He said I needed to eat somewhere that served food on actual plates instead of takeout containers." A shadow crossed his face. "We don't talk much anymore." There was something vulnerable in that admission, a crack in the armor that Rosie found herself wanting to explore. But before she could respond, a server appeared, a young woman with bright pink hair and a smile that could power the entire city block. "Welcome to Magnolia's. I'm Skylar, and I'll be taking care of you today. Can I start you off with something to drink?" "Coffee, black," Wagner said automatically. "Sweet tea, please," Rosie added, earning a surprised look from Wagner. "Excellent choice," Skylar beamed. "The sweet tea here is legendary. My grandmother's recipe. She's been making it the same way for 40 years. I'll give you folks a few minutes to look at the menu." As Skylar bounced away, Wagner studied Rosie with newfound curiosity. "Sweet tea," he repeated. "I wouldn't have guessed." "There's probably a lot you wouldn't guess about me," Rosie replied, then immediately regretted the words. They sounded more provocative than she'd intended, carrying implications she wasn't ready to examine. But Wagner didn't seem to take offense. If anything, he looked intrigued. "You're right," he said quietly. "I've spent 6 months working with you, and I realize I don't know anything about who you actually are. What you like, what you dream about, what makes you laugh." He paused, his steel blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I know that's my fault." The honesty in his voice made Rosie's chest tighten. This was dangerous territory, personal, intimate in a way that had nothing to do with legal briefs or corporate hierarchies. "It goes both ways," she found herself saying. "I never asked about your brother or why you work 16-hour days or what you do when you're not at the office." She picked up her napkin, needing something to do with her hands. "I just assumed you were this untouchable perfectionist who lived and breathed contracts." "Not untouchable," Wagner said softly. "Just careful. Maybe too careful." Skylar returned with their drinks and took their lunch orders, a turkey and avocado sandwich. For Rosie, grilled chicken and vegetables for Wagner. Simple choices that somehow felt significant in the context of this conversation that was definitely not about the Kellerman case. "Can I ask you something?" Wagner said, after Skylar had left again. Rosie nodded, though part of her wanted to run. "In the video, you mentioned choosing between groceries and gas money. Is that—" He struggled with the words, clearly uncomfortable. "Are things that difficult?" Heat crept up Rosie's neck. The last thing she wanted was Wagner's pity, his wealthy, white guilt over her financial struggles. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "I don't need—" "That's not what I'm asking." Wagner leaned forward slightly, his voice gentle but persistent. "I'm asking because I've been so focused on pushing you to be better that I never stopped to consider whether I was pushing you toward a cliff." The metaphor hit closer to home than Rosie cared to admit. Some nights, lying awake at 2 a.m. staring at her bank balance, she did feel like she was standing on the edge of something that could swallow her whole. Law school loans, she admitted finally. Rent in this city. My mum's been sick, so I've been helping with her medical bills. The words came easier than she'd expected. I knew what I was getting into when I chose this career, but sometimes the math just doesn't work out the way you planned. Wagner was quiet for a long moment, and Rosie wondered if she'd said too much. This was exactly the kind of personal information that could be used against her. Ammunition for future performance reviews or termination proceedings. I'm sorry, he said finally. For what? For not seeing it? For adding to the pressure instead of being someone you could talk to? His hands wrapped around his coffee mug like an anchor. My father used to say that leadership meant making people better, not just making them work harder. I think I forgot that somewhere along the way. Their food arrived, providing a welcome interruption to the intensity building between them. But even as they ate, the conversation continued to flow in directions Rosie had never imagined possible. Wagner told her about his brother, a social worker in Atlanta who'd called him heartless during their last argument. He talked about the weight of expectations, the family legacy he'd inherited along with his position at the firm. He admitted that he couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a meal without thinking about work, the last time he'd laughed until his stomach hurt, Return. Rosie found herself sharing stories about law school, about the scholarship that had made her education possible, about the professor who'd encouraged her to apply to Morrison & Associates in the first place. She talked about her mother's strength during her cancer treatment, about Sunday dinners with her family where everyone argued about politics and football with equal passion. Your mother raised an incredible daughter, Wagner said when she finished describing her mum's latest remission celebration. The compliment, simple and sincere, hit Rosie harder than any of the professional praise she'd been craving for months. She'd like you, Rosie heard herself saying, then immediately wanted to take it back. The implication was too personal, too forward. But Wagner smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. I'd like to meet her someday, he said, and the words hung in the air between them like a promise neither of them was ready to examine too closely. As they finished their meal, Rosie realized they hadn't discussed the Kellerman case at all. This lunch had been about something else entirely. Two people discovering they weren't who they'd thought the other was. We should probably head back, Wagner said eventually, glancing at his watch. Probably, Rosie agreed, though neither of them moved to leave. Outside the cafe, standing in the afternoon sunlight that made Wagner's eyes look more silver than steel, Rosie felt like she was standing at a crossroads. The safe path led back to the office, back to the familiar dynamic of boss and employee, back to keeping professional distance and personal walls intact. The other path led somewhere uncharted and dangerous, where a man named Wagner looked at her like she was worth knowing, and a woman named Rosie was brave enough to let him try. Thank you, she said quietly. For lunch, for listening. Thank you for giving me the chance, Wagner replied. I know I don't deserve it. As they walked back toward the office building, their reflections caught in the glass doors, Rosie couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them. The question was whether they were brave, enough to see where it led. The elevator ride back to the 15th floor felt different. Rosie stood beside Wagner in the confined space, acutely aware of the way his sleeve occasionally brushed against hers, the subtle scent of his cologne mixing with the lingering aroma of coffee on their clothes. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged with something she couldn't name. Expectation, possibility, or maybe just the dangerous knowledge that they'd crossed a line neither had intended to approach. When the doors opened, reality crashed back like a cold wave. Well, look who's back from their little lunch date. The voice belonged to Eric Dawson, a senior associate with perfectly styled brown hair and the kind of smile that never reached. His eyes. He was leaning against the reception desk, chatting with Margaret, the office manager, but his attention had clearly been focused on the elevators. Rosie felt her cheeks burn. It was a business lunch, Eric. Of course it was, Eric replied, his tone dripping with false innocence. The Kellerman case, right? Must be quite a complex matter to require such intimate consultation. Wagner stepped forward slightly, and Rosie could feel the shift in his energy, the return of the cold, authoritative executive she'd worked under for months. "Is there something you need, Dawson?" Wagner's voice carried the kind of ice that had once made Rosie's stomach clench with anxiety. "Just wondering about the chain of command," Eric said, straightening his tie with deliberate casualness. "I've been working the Morrison case for 3 weeks, but I see the final prep went to Coleman instead. Interesting allocation of resources." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Rosie's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. "Resource allocation is my decision," Wagner said coldly. "If you have concerns about your workload, schedule a meeting with HR. Eric's smile widened. "Oh, I'm not concerned about my workload, just workplace dynamics, professional boundaries, that sort of thing." Margaret, clearly sensing the tension, suddenly found urgent filing to attend to. Other staff members who'd been lingering in the area began to disperse, leaving Rosie feeling exposed and vulnerable under Eric's calculating gaze. "If you'll excuse us," Wagner said, his tone making it clear it wasn't really a request, "we have work to discuss." As they walked toward Wagner's office, Rosie could feel Eric's eyes following them. She knew that look, predatory, opportunistic. Eric Dawson was the kind of man who collected information like currency, storing away every whisper and glance for future use. Inside Wagner's office, with the door safely closed, the atmosphere from lunch evaporated completely. "This is a problem," Wagner said without preamble, moving to stand behind his desk like it was a fortress wall. "What?" Rosie asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. "People are talking, speculating." He ran a hand through his short hair, disturbing its perfect styling for the first time she'd ever witnessed. Lunch was a mistake. The words hit Rosie like a slap. Just an hour ago, this man had been telling her about his family, sharing vulnerabilities she'd never imagined he possessed. Now he was back to treating their connection like a liability to be managed. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "You know what I mean," Wagner said, but his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. "The optics, the implications. I can't have people thinking that your assignments are based on anything other than merit." "And what would they be based on?" Rosie asked, taking a step closer to his desk. "Because an hour ago, you were the one suggesting we figure things out together." Wagner's jaw tightened. "An hour ago, we weren't being watched by every gossip in the building. So that's it? One snide comment from Eric Dawson and you're back to treating me like I'm contagious? I'm trying to protect—" "Don't." Rosie's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Don't you dare say you're trying to protect me. You're protecting yourself, your reputation, your precious professional image." The accusation hung between them like a challenge. Wagner's steel-blue eyes flashed with something that might have been hurt or anger. She couldn't tell which. "You think this is easy for me?" he asked quietly. "You think I don't know what people will say, what they'll assume?" "I think you care. More about what they'll say than about what's actually happening between us." The words were out before Rosie could stop them, raw and honest, and far more revealing than she'd intended. Wagner stared at her, and for a moment she saw the man from the cafe, vulnerable, uncertain, human. Then his professional mask slammed back into place. "Nothing is happening between us," he said firmly. "Nothing can happen. I'm your supervisor. You're a junior associate, and that's all this can ever be." Rosie felt something inside her chest crack, but she kept her voice steady. "Fine. Is there anything else you need regarding the Kellerman case? Because I have work to do." Wagner opened, his mouth as if to say something else, then seemed to think better of it. "The brief is due Friday. I trust you'll handle it with your usual professionalism." The dismissal was clear. Rosie turned toward the door, her hand on the handle when Wagner's voice stopped her. "Rosie." She looked back, hating the way her name sounded when he said it, like an apology he wasn't brave enough to make. "Be careful around Dawson. He's not as harmless as he appears." It was a warning, maybe even protection of a sort, but it felt hollow after everything they'd shared and everything he'd just taken back. "I can handle Eric Dawson," she said coolly. I've been handling difficult men my entire career." The words were meant to sting, and from the flash of pain in Wagner's eyes, she knew they'd hit their mark. Back at her desk, Rosie threw herself into the Kellerman files with aggressive focus, trying to drown out the whispers she could hear from nearby cubicles. The words were indistinct, but the tone was clear. Speculation, judgment, the kind of office gossip that could destroy a reputation overnight. Her phone buzzed with a text from Nia. How was lunch with Mr. Tall, dark and impossible? Rosie stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Educational." Another buzz. That doesn't sound good. "Want to talk about it over wine tonight? Rain check. Have to work late." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did have work to finish, but more than that, she needed space to think. To figure out how she'd gone from feeling like she was finally connecting with Wagner to feeling like she'd been played for a fool in the span of a single elevator ride. Around 6 p.m., as the office began to empty, Rosie became aware of a presence, hovering near her desk. She looked up to find Eric Dawson standing there, his suit jacket slung over one arm, his smile sharp enough to cut diamonds. "Working late again?" he asked, perching on the edge of her desk uninvited. "That's dedication, or maybe desperation. Can I help you with something, Eric?" "Actually, I think I might be able to help you." He leaned closer, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "See, I couldn't help but notice the chemistry between you and our fearless leader today. Very romantic, very touching, very dangerous." Rosie's blood turned to ice. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, I think you do." Eric's smile widened. "And I think Wagner does too. The question is, what are you willing to do to keep this little workplace romance from becoming public knowledge?" The threat was clear, even wrapped in Eric's casual tone. Rosie felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, and Eric Dawson was holding the rope. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Just a little favor," Eric said, pulling out his phone and showing her a document on the screen. "The Morrison case. There's a piece of evidence that Wagner's been keeping close to his chest. Something that could change the entire trajectory of the trial. I need to know what it is." "I can't or won't?" Eric's voice hardened. "Because I have to tell you, Rosie, office affairs don't usually end well for the junior associate, especially when there's already a video floating." A round of said associate bad-mouthing her superior. Rosie's world tilted. "What video?" Eric's smile was predatory now. "Oh, didn't Wagner mention?" "Interesting. Very interesting indeed." He slid off her desk and straightened his tie, looking like a cat who'd just cornered a particularly delicious mouse. "Think about it, sweetheart. I'll be in touch." As Eric walked away, whistling softly under his breath, Rosie sat frozen at her desk, her mind racing. The video, her video, was still out there, still dangerous, and now Eric Dawson knew about it. Worse than that, Wagner had known and hadn't told her. The trust they'd built over lunch, fragile as it was, crumbled like sand in her hands, leaving her more alone and vulnerable than she'd ever been. Rosie didn't go home that night. Instead, she sat in her car in the parking garage beneath Morrison & Associates until nearly midnight, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The concrete walls seemed to close in around her, echoing with the weight of Eric's threats, and the crushing realization that Wagner had betrayed her trust before she'd even known she'd given it. The video, her video, still out there, still dangerous, and Wagner had known about it all along. Every moment of their lunch conversation played back in her mind with new, darker meaning. His vulnerability, his confessions, his promise that they'd figure things out together, all of it had been a lie, or worse, manipulation. A way to control the narrative while keeping her in the dark about the sword hanging over her head. Her phone had been buzzing intermittently with texts from Nia, but Rosie couldn't bring herself to look at them. How could she explain that she'd been stupid enough to trust the man who held her career hostage? How could she admit that for a few hours she'd actually believed Wagner might care about her as more than just another problem to manage? When she finally made it home to her studio apartment, Rosie went straight to her laptop and pulled up every piece of information she could find about the Morrison case. If Eric wanted insider information, she needed to understand exactly what ammunition she was sitting on. and what Wagner was hiding. The case files painted a clear picture. Morrison Industries was being sued for environmental damage stemming from a chemical spill that had contaminated groundwater in 3 rural Virginia counties. The plaintiffs were mostly working-class families whose wells had been poisoned, their property values destroyed, their health compromised. It was the kind of David versus Goliath battle that had originally inspired Rosie to pursue law, and Morrison and Associates was representing Goliath. As she dug deeper into the discovery documents, a pattern began to emerge. There were gaps in the evidence, inconsistencies in the timeline, references to documents that seemed to be missing from the file. Either Wagner was incredibly disorganized, which seemed unlikely, or there was information being deliberately withheld. At 2 a.m., exhausted and no closer to understanding what Eric was after, Rosie finally collapsed into bed. But sleep brought no peace, only dreams of steel-blue eyes and promises that crumbled like ash in her hands. The next morning arrived grey and drizzling, matching her mood perfectly. Rosie dressed with mechanical precision, navy suit, hair in a tight bun, armor for the battle she knew was coming. She'd made her decision somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn. She was going to confront Wagner directly. No more games, no more manipulation. Just the truth, however ugly it might be. The office felt different when she arrived, charged with an undercurrent of whispered conversations and meaningful glances. Word had clearly spread about yesterday's business lunch, and Rosie could feel the weight of speculation following her through the hallways like a shadow. Wagner's door was closed when she reached his office, but she could see him through the glass partition, hunched over his computer with the kind of focused intensity she'd once admired. Now it just looked like a man trying to avoid the consequences of his choices. She knocked once sharply and entered without waiting for permission. "We need to talk," she said, closing the door behind her with deliberate force. Wagner looked up, and she saw immediately that he hadn't slept either. His usually perfect appearance showed subtle signs of strain, stubble he'd missed while shaving, a tie that was slightly askew, shadows under his eyes that made them look more grey than blue. "Rosie, about yesterday." "About the video?" she interrupted, her voice cutting through his attempted explanation like a blade. "The one you've known about all along, the one you forgot to mention while you were playing the understanding boss routine." Wagner went very still, and she watched understanding dawn in his expression. Not guilt. She might have forgiven guilt. This was calculation, the look of a man trying to figure out how much she knew and how much damage control he'd need to do. "How did you—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening. "Dawson." "Does it matter how I found out?" Rosie stepped closer to his desk, her hands steady despite the fury coursing through her veins. "What matters is that you lied. You sat across from me at that cafe, told me about your family, made me believe you actually gave a damn about who I was, and all the while you were holding that video like a loaded gun." "It wasn't like that," Wagner said, standing up as if the extra height would give him some advantage in this conversation. "Then what was it like?" Rosie's voice rose slightly before she caught herself and forced it back to professional levels. "Were you planning to use it against me? Hold it over my head to keep me in line? Or were you just enjoying the power of knowing something that could destroy my career?" "I was trying to protect you." The words exploded out of Wagner with more emotion than she'd ever heard from him. "That video, if it gets out, if the wrong people see it, your career at this firm is over. I was trying to find a way to contain it, to make it disappear." "By lying to me. By pretending we were building some kind of trust while you were busy. Playing puppet master." Rosie laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to make Wagner flinch. "You know what the worst part is? I actually started to believe you. I thought maybe you'd changed. Maybe you saw me as more than just another junior associate to push around. I do see you as more—" "Stop." Rosie held up a hand, her dark eyes blazing with hurt and fury. "Just stop. Whatever game you're playing, whatever angle you're working, I'm done being your pawn." Wagner moved around his desk, closing the distance between them until she could see the desperation in his eyes. "It's not a game," he said quietly. "Yesterday, at lunch, that was real. more real than anything I've felt in years. But the video complicates everything, and I didn't know how to tell you without what? Without admitting that you've been manipulating me from the beginning?" Rosie backed toward the door, needing distance from the raw honesty in his voice. It would be so easy to believe him, to fall back into the fantasy that Wagner Bosch might actually care about her. But she'd learned her lesson about trusting men in positions of power. "I never manipulated you," Wagner said, and there was something almost pleading in his tone. "The video, I found it by accident, and yes, I should have told you immediately. But everything else, everything between us, that's been honest." "Has it?" Rosie's hand found the door handle behind her. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you used my own words against me to get close enough to control the damage. Very efficient, very Wagner Bosch." She saw the hit land, watched something die in his expression. "If that's what you think of me," he said slowly, "then maybe you're right. Maybe this was a mistake from the beginning." The words should have felt like victory, but instead, they cut through her like ice. This was what she'd wanted, to see through. His facade, to protect herself from whatever game he was playing. So why did watching him retreat behind his professional mask feel like losing something precious? "The Morrison case," she said, forcing herself back to safer ground. "Eric thinks you're hiding evidence, is he right?" Wagner's expression shuttered completely. "That's none of your concern. It is if he's using it to blackmail me." What did he want? For a moment, Rosie considered telling him about Eric's demands, about the choice she was being forced to make, between her integrity and her career. But the wall between them was back up, higher and stronger than ever. "That's none of your concern," she said, throwing his words back at him. She turned to leave, but Wagner's voice stopped her at the door. "Rosie." Her name sounded broken when he said it now. "Whatever Dawson threatened, whatever he wants you to do, don't. I'll handle it." She looked back at him one last time, memorizing the way the morning light fell across his face, the vulnerable set of his shoulders, the man she'd glimpsed beneath the executive facade. "You've handled enough," she said quietly, and walked out of his office, leaving the wreckage of whatever they'd almost been scattered across the expensive carpet behind. Back at her desk, Rosie opened her laptop and stared at the Morrison files with new eyes. Somewhere in these documents was the information Eric wanted, the leverage that could save her career, or destroy what remained of her principles. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Tick-tock, sweetheart. Clock's running." Rosie deleted the message and got back to work, but she could feel the walls closing in around her. In trying to escape one trap, she'd walked straight into another. And this time she was completely alone. 3 days passed like a slow torture. Rosie moved through the office like a ghost, maintaining the facade of professionalism, while her world crumbled around her. She attended meetings, filed motions, reviewed contracts, all while feeling like she was watching someone else's life through a window. The Kellerman case sat on her desk like an accusation, but every time she tried to focus on it, her mind drifted to steel blue eyes and the memory of trust that had turned to ash in her hands. Wagner had kept his distance since their confrontation, communicating only through terse emails and formal memos. When their paths crossed in the hallway, he looked through her as if she were invisible, his expression carved from stone. It was exactly what she'd said she wanted, but the silence between them felt like a physical wound. Eric, meanwhile, was everywhere. He appeared at her desk with casual frequency, always with some innocent excuse, borrowing a stapler, asking about a case precedent, making small talk about the weather. But his presence was a constant reminder of the choice hanging over her head, the deadline that drew closer with each passing hour. Find out what Wagner's hiding or watch your career burn. On Thursday evening, as the office emptied around her, Rosie found herself alone with the Morrison files spread across her desk like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't solve. She'd been through every document 3 times, looking for the missing piece that would satisfy Eric's demands. But all she'd found were more questions. There were definitely gaps in the evidence, correspondence that referenced meetings with no records, environmental, reports that seemed incomplete, witness statements that ended abruptly. But without access to Wagner's private files, she couldn't determine what was being hidden or why. Her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. Running out of time, beautiful. Hope you're not too attached to that law license, Rosie. Stared at the message until the words blurred, then deleted it with shaking fingers. She was trapped in an impossible situation: betray Wagner's trust, what little remained of it, or face the destruction of everything she'd worked for. Either choice would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. Working late again? The voice made her jump. She looked up to find Troy Mackenzie standing beside her desk, his usually friendly expression clouded with concern. Just trying. To get ahead, Rosie replied, quickly closing the Morrison files. Troy glanced around the nearly empty office, then pulled a chair closer to her desk and sat down. Look, I know we're not super close, he said quietly, but I've been watching what's happening and I wanted to say something. Rosie's stomach clenched. I don't know what you mean. Eric Dawson, Troy said bluntly. I've seen him hovering around your desk, and I know that guy well enough to recognize when he's working an angle. Whatever he's got on you, whatever he wants, it's not worth it. The kindness in his voice almost broke her. For a moment, Rosie considered telling him everything. The video, the blackmail, the impossible choice she was facing. But Troy was a good guy trying to survive in the same cutthroat environment. She couldn't drag him into her mess. I can handle Eric, she said, forcing a smile. Can you? Troy leaned forward, his expression serious. Because I worked with him on the Patterson merger last year, and I watched him destroy a paralegal's career just because she wouldn't help him steal credit for someone else's work. He's dangerous, Rosie. More dangerous than you think. Before Rosie could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the quiet office. They both looked up to see Wagner emerge from the elevator, his coat slung over one arm, looking like he was ready to leave for the night. Troy stood quickly, suddenly uncomfortable. Just think about what I said, okay? He hurried back to his own desk, leaving Rosie alone as Wagner approached. For a moment she thought he might walk past without acknowledging her, but he stopped at the edge of her workspace. You're working late, he observed, his voice carefully neutral. The Kellerman brief won't write itself, she replied, not looking up from her computer screen. Wagner was quiet for a long moment, and she could feel him studying her with that intense focus that had once made her nervous for entirely different reasons. Have you eaten? He asked suddenly. The question caught her off guard. She looked up to find him watching her with something that might have been concern, though his expression remained guarded. I'm fine, she said automatically. That's not what I asked. Rosie realized she couldn't actually remember the last time she'd eaten a full meal. The stress of the past few days had killed her appetite, leaving her surviving on coffee and determination. I'll grab something on the way home, she lied. Wagner's jaw tightened slightly, and for a moment she thought he might say something else. Instead, he nodded curtly and turned to leave. Wagner. His name left her lips before she could stop it, and he turned back with something almost like hope in his steel blue eyes. The Morrison case, she said, hating herself for what she was about to do but seeing no other choice. I've been reviewing the files and there seem to be some inconsistencies in the evidence timeline. The hope in Wagner's expression died, replaced by professional wariness. What kind of inconsistencies? Missing correspondence, incomplete reports. It looks like there might be documents that weren't included in discovery. She forced herself to meet his gaze directly. Is there something I should know about this case? Wagner went very still, and she watched him retreat behind the familiar mask of executive authority. The discovery process is complex, he said carefully. Not every piece of paperwork makes it into the final filing. But if there's evidence, that could impact the case. Miss Coleman, Wagner interrupted, and the formal address hit her like a slap. Your job is to work with the materials you've been given, not to question the strategic decisions of senior partners. The coldness in his voice was designed to shut down the conversation, but Rosie pressed on, driven by desperation and the ticking clock of Eric's deadline. What if the plaintiff's attorneys found out? What if they filed a motion claiming discovery? Violations. Something flickered in Wagner's eyes, fear maybe, or guilt. That won't happen. How can you be sure? Because, Wagner said quietly, the missing documents don't exist anymore. The admission hung between them like a confession, and Rosie felt the last of her illusions about Wagner Bosch crumble away. He wasn't just hiding evidence, he'd destroyed it. "You destroyed evidence in an environmental case," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Evidence that could prove Morrison Industries poisoned those families' water supply." Wagner's face had gone pale, but his voice remained steady. "I protected my client's interests within the bounds of legal ethics, by making sure the truth never comes to light, by ensuring that speculation and circumstantial evidence don't destroy a company that employs 3,000 people. Rosie stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the man she'd almost allowed herself to care about. This wasn't about legal strategy or client protection. This was about winning at any cost, even if it meant letting innocent families suffer for corporate negligence. "Those people," she said, her voice growing stronger with righteous anger, "those families who can't drink their own water, who can't sell their homes because the land is contaminated, they deserve justice. They deserve the truth." "They deserve competent legal representation," Wagner replied coldly, "which they have. The case will be settled, they'll receive compensation, and everyone moves on. Everyone except the families who'll never get their lives back." Wagner moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "This conversation is over, Miss Coleman, and if you're smart, you'll remember that your employment here depends on your ability to represent our clients' interests, not your personal sense of justice." The threat was clear, but instead of intimidating her, it crystallized something in Rosie's mind. She'd been so focused on protecting her career, on survival, that she'd lost sight of why she'd wanted to be a lawyer in the first place. "You're right," she said quietly. "This conversation is over." Wagner studied her face for a long moment, perhaps sensing that something fundamental had shifted in her resolve. "Go home, Rosie," he said, and there was something almost sad in the way he said her name. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll pretend this never happened." But as Wagner walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty office, Rosie knew she couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't pretend that what he'd done was acceptable. She couldn't pretend that her career was worth more than the truth, and she couldn't pretend that the man she'd almost fallen for was anything other than exactly what she'd originally thought. A powerful, ruthless executive who would sacrifice anyone and anything to win. Alone in the fluorescent-lit office, surrounded by the evidence of corporate corruption and moral compromise, Rosie Amara Coleman made the decision that would change everything. She was going to do the right thing, even if it destroyed her. The rain started just after midnight, drumming against Rosie's apartment window like an accusation. She sat cross-legged on her narrow bed, laptop balanced on her knees, staring at the cursor blinking in an empty email draft. The contact information for the plaintiff's attorneys in the Morrison case glowed on her screen, a phone number and email address that represented a point of no return. One click, she thought, one email, and everything changes. Her phone lay silent. Beside her, 13 missed calls from Nia finally giving way to worried silence. Rosie couldn't bear to hear her best friend's voice right now, couldn't handle the inevitable questions about why she looked like she'd been hit by a truck, why she was considering throwing away everything she'd worked for, because that's what this was really. Career suicide wrapped in moral righteousness. The evidence was all there in the files she'd photographed with her phone, fragments of a larger truth that Wagner had tried to bury, internal memos acknowledging the contamination, suppressed soil samples showing chemical levels far beyond EPA safety standards, witness statements that had been lost before they could be submitted to discovery. 3,000 jobs, Wagner had said, but what about the 3,000 people whose lives had been destroyed by Morrison Industries' negligence? What about the children who couldn't play in their own backyards? The elderly residents whose retirement savings had evaporated along with their property values? Rosie's finger hovered over the send button as another memory surfaced. Wagner in the cafe, vulnerable and human, talking about his father's definition of leadership. Making people better, not just making them work harder. Had that conversation been real, or just another layer of manipulation? At this point, she wasn't sure she could trust her own judgment about anything involving Wagner alias Bosch. Her laptop chimed with an incoming message, and Rosie's blood ran cold when she saw the sender. Eric D. Morrison, Associates.com still up. I see. Glass walls in this building, very easy to spot late-night research sessions. Hope you found what I'm looking for. Clock runs out at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Don't disappoint me, sweetheart. Rosie slammed the laptop shut, her hands shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. Even here in the supposed safety of her own apartment, Eric's reach extended like a virus, poisoning everything it touched. She stood and moved to her kitchen, 3 steps in the cramped studio, and poured herself a glass of water she didn't want. The medication bottle on her counter caught her eye, but she pushed past it. She needed to feel everything tonight, needed the sharp edges of anxiety and fear to cut through any lingering delusions about easy choices. At 3 a.m. she finally made the call. Virginia Legal Aid Society, this is our after-hours service. If this is an emergency, I need to speak with someone about the Morrison Industries case, Rosie interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. I have information about evidence that was withheld from discovery. The process took 4 hours. 4 hours of careful questioning, of uploading documents to secure servers, of explaining how she'd gained access to the suppressed evidence, and why she was coming forward now. The attorney who handled whistleblower cases, a woman named Carmen Velasco, with a voice like steel wrapped in velvet, didn't judge or question her motives. She simply documented everything with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen corporate corruption destroy too many lives. When it was over, Rosie sat in her car in the legal aid parking lot, watching the sun rise over Richmond and feeling like she was seeing the world with new eyes. The decision was made, the die cast. By noon, the plaintiff's attorneys would have enough evidence to file motions that would blow the Morrison case wide open. And by tonight, Rosie Amara Coleman would probably be unemployed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Wagner. Need to see you. In my office first thing this morning. Urgent. Rosie stared at the message, wondering if he already knew what she'd done, if Eric had somehow discovered her midnight betrayal. It didn't matter. She'd crossed the line, and there was no going back now. She drove to Morrison and Associates through the early morning traffic, noting absently how normal everything looked. Commuters with their coffee cups and tired eyes, delivery trucks navigating, narrow downtown streets, the familiar rhythm of a city waking up. None of them knew that the foundations of several careers were about to crumble, that the ripples from one junior associate's decision would spread far beyond the walls of a single law firm. The office was buzzing with unusual energy when she arrived. Clusters of attorneys huddled in urgent conversation, their voices low but intense. Margaret, the office manager, looked pale and stressed as she fielded what seemed like an endless stream of phone calls. Rosie! Troy appeared at her elbow, his face tight with concern. Thank God you're here. Have you seen the news? What news? Troy pulled out his phone and showed her a news app alert. Breaking. New evidence emerges in Morrison Industries. Environmental lawsuit. Rosie's heart stopped. That's fast. The plaintiffs filed an emergency motion at dawn, Troy continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. They're claiming Morrison and Associates withheld critical evidence during discovery. The judge is calling for an immediate hearing. Around them, the office hummed with barely controlled panic. Senior partners swept through the halls like generals, preparing for war, their faces grim and focused. Junior associates scurried between offices carrying files and looking terrified of being blamed for whatever catastrophe was unfolding. Wagner's been looking for you, Troy added. He seemed intense, more intense than usual if that's possible. Rosie nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. This was it, the moment when everything she'd built came crashing down. But as she looked around at the chaos, at the fear in her colleagues' eyes, she found she wasn't sorry. These people had chosen to build their careers on lies and cover-ups. She'd chosen something different. Wagner's office door was closed, but she could see him through the glass wall, pacing like a caged animal. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, tie loose, sleeves rolled up, hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. She knocked once and entered without, waiting for permission. "Close the door," Wagner said without looking at her. Rosie complied, then turned to face him. His steel blue eyes were bloodshot with exhaustion and something that might have been fury. "Did you do this?" he asked quietly. There was no point in lying. Yes, Wagner stopped pacing and stared at her for a long moment. She waited for the explosion, the rage, the professional destruction she'd earned with her betrayal. Instead, he sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. Jesus, Rosie. Do you have any idea what you've done? I did what was right, she said, keeping her voice steady. Right. Wagner's head snapped up, and now she could see the full extent of his fury. You've destroyed everything. The case, the firm's reputation, my career. Your career? Rosie stepped closer to his desk, her own anger finally breaking free. What about the families who trusted the legal system to protect them? What about the children who've been drinking poisoned water while you played games with evidence? Those families will get their settlement. They'll get justice, Rosie interrupted. Something they never would have gotten if you'd had your... Wait. Wagner stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward with the force of the movement. You naive little girl. You think justice is more important than 3,000 jobs. You think destroying Morrison Industries will bring back clean water or fix the contamination. I think the truth is more important than protecting corporate profits. The truth? Wagner laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to make Rosie flinch. The truth is that you've just signed the death warrant for this firm. When the dust settles, when Morrison Industries files bankruptcy to avoid the judgment, when 3,000 families lose their income because their self-righteous crusader decided to play hero, where will your precious justice be then? The words hit Rosie like physical blows, but she held her ground. At least I'll be able to sleep at night. Will you? Wagner moved around his desk, closing the distance between them until she could see the pain beneath his anger. When you're unemployed and blacklisted from every decent firm in Virginia, when your law school loans come due and you can't make the payments, when you're living in your car because your moral victory doesn't pay rent. Each question was designed to wound, to make her doubt the choice she'd made. And they worked. She could feel her resolve wavering under the weight of practical reality. I'll figure it out, she said quietly. No, Wagner replied, his voice dropping to something almost gentle. You won't, because this isn't just about one case or one firm. You've made yourself radioactive, Rosie. No one will hire the lawyer who destroyed her own client's case. The truth of his words settled over her like a shroud. She'd known this would cost her, but hearing it laid out so starkly made the magnitude of her sacrifice finally real. Then I'll find another way to practice law, she said, though the words felt hollow. Wagner studied her face for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted. Why? He asked softly. Why throw away everything for people you've never met? People who will never know what you sacrificed for them? The question hung between them like a bridge, and for a moment Rosie saw past his anger to the confusion beneath it. This was a man who'd spent his entire career in a world where winning was everything, where moral compromises were just the cost of doing business. He genuinely couldn't understand why she'd chosen differently. Because, she said, her voice growing stronger, someone has to. Someone has to care more about doing what's right than about what's profitable. Someone has to remember that the law is supposed to protect people, not just corporations. Wagner's expression cracked, and for just an instant, she saw the man from the cafe again, vulnerable, uncertain, maybe even admiring her choice despite himself. Then the moment passed and the executive mask slammed back into place. Clear out your desk, he said coldly. Security will escort you out in 1 hour. Rosie nodded, surprised by how calm she felt. Can I ask you something? Wagner waited. Do you even remember why you became a lawyer? Before the money and the power and the corner office, what made you think law was worth your life? She saw the hit land, watched him flinch as if she'd struck him physically. Get out, he said quietly. As Rosie walked toward the door, she heard Wagner's voice behind her, so soft she almost missed it. I'm sorry. She turned back, but he was already facing the window, his shoulders rigid with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. So am I, she replied, and walked out of his office for the last time. 2 weeks later, Rosie stood in the rain outside Magnolia's kitchen, watching through the window as life continued without her. The cafe looked exactly the same. Warm light, spilling onto the sidewalk, the comforting bustle of the lunch crowd. the handwritten menu board that had charmed her during what now felt like a lifetime ago. But everything else had changed. The woman staring back at her in the rain-streaked glass was a stranger, unemployed, blacklisted, surviving on unemployment benefits and the rapidly dwindling savings account that had once felt like security. She shouldn't be here. Had no business torturing herself with memories of the one moment when she'd thought Wagner might be different, might be real. But something had drawn her back to this place, some masochistic need to remember what hope had felt like before reality crushed it. The headlines had been brutal. Morrison and Associates under investigation for evidence tampering. Environmental. Lawyers demand criminal charges in corporate cover-up. Junior associate blows whistle on law firm corruption. Rosie's name had been kept out of most reports, but in the insular world of Virginia legal practice, anonymity was impossible. She'd applied to 17 firms in 2 weeks. 17 rejections, each more politely devastating than the last. Word traveled fast in their profession, and she'd become radioactive exactly as Wagner had predicted. Her phone buzzed with another text from Nia. "Stop wallowing and come to dinner." "Mom's making your favorite." Rosie almost smiled. Nia's family had basically adopted her since the scandal broke, offering support and comfort that Rosie wasn't sure she deserved. They saw her choice as heroic, but sitting in her car watching raindrops race down the windshield, heroism felt a lot like stupidity. She was about to drive away when she saw him. Wagner emerged from the cafe's entrance, and Rosie's breath caught in her throat. He looked different, thinner, more worn, the sharp edges of his executive armor dulled by what looked like weeks of sleepless nights. His usually perfect suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, and when he turned to scan the street, she saw something in his expression that made her chest ache. He looked lost. Their eyes met through the rain and glass, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then Wagner was walking toward her car, his stride purposeful despite the weather soaking through his expensive suit. Rosie rolled down her window, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What are you doing here?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady. "I could ask you the same question." Wagner's steel-blue eyes were softer than she remembered, tinged with something that might have been regret. "This was our place, wasn't it? The one time we got it right. Our place." The words hit her harder than they should have. "I should go," she said, reaching for the gear shift. "Don't." The single word stopped her hand mid-motion. "Please. We need to talk. I think we said everything we needed to say, did we?" Wagner stepped closer, rain dripping from his hair onto her car door. "Because I've been replaying that conversation for 2 weeks, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion." "Which is?" "You were right." The admission hung in the rain-soaked air between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they could cross. "About what?" Rosie asked quietly. "About everything." Wagner's voice was raw with exhaustion and something deeper. "About the case, about what we did, about what I became." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "About why I got into law in the first place." Against her better judgment, Rosie found herself unlocking the passenger door. "Get in before you drown." Wagner slid into the seat beside her, bringing with him the scent of rain and that familiar cologne that still made her pulse quicken, despite everything. In the confined space of her car, he seemed larger somehow, his presence filling every available inch. "You destroyed your career for strangers," he said without preamble. "People you'd never met who will never know what you sacrificed. I couldn't understand it. And now you do." Wagner was quiet for a long moment, staring through the windshield. At the cafe where they'd shared what might have been the most honest conversation of his life. "My father called me yesterday," he said finally. First time we'd spoken in 3 years, he'd seen the news coverage about Morrison and Associates, about the evidence tampering. Wagner's jaw tightened. "He asked me if I remembered why I wanted to be a lawyer when I was 8 years old. Do you?" There was this case, a family in our neighborhood whose house burned down because the city had cut corners on fire department funding. Insurance wouldn't pay because of some technicality, and they lost everything. Wagner's voice grew distant with memory. "I told my father I was going to be a lawyer so I could help people like that, so I could make sure the powerful couldn't hurt the powerless." Rosie felt something shift in her chest, a dangerous softening. toward the man beside her. "What happened to that 8-year-old?" she asked gently. "He got lost somewhere between law school rankings and billable hour requirements." Wagner turned to look at her directly. "Between corner offices and client dinners and the intoxicating rush of winning at any cost. Wagner, I resigned. The..." Words hit Rosie like a physical blow. "What?" "Yesterday morning, effective immediately." His smile was bitter, but somehow more genuine than any expression she'd seen from him in their months of working together. "Turns out, when you destroy evidence in a federal environmental case, partnership becomes somewhat challenging." Rosie stared at him, trying to process what he was telling her. "You resigned from Morrison and Associates?" "I was given the choice between resignation and termination. I chose to leave with what little dignity remained." Wagner's laugh held no humor. "Funny thing is, walking out of that building for the last time, I felt lighter than I had in years." "Where will you go? What will you do?" "I don't know." The admission seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. "For the first time since law school, I have no plan, no strategy, no 5-year career projection. It's terrifying and liberating." They sat in silence for a moment, the rain drumming a steady rhythm on the car roof. Two casualties of the same moral reckoning, both of them starting over from nothing. "I'm sorry," Wagner said suddenly. "For everything. For the way I treated you, for lying about the video, for putting you in an impossible position." He turned in his seat to face her fully. "Most of all, I'm sorry for making you choose between your principles and your career. You shouldn't have had to make that choice alone." Rosie felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. "I wasn't alone. I had my conscience. Cold comfort when you're looking at unemployment and student loan payments. Better than selling my soul for a corner office." Wagner flinched at the bar but didn't argue. "You're right, again. Stop agreeing with me," Rosie said, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "It's unsettling." That earned her a small, genuine smile, the first she'd seen from him since their lunch at Magnolia's. "I've been doing a lot of thinking these past 2 weeks," Wagner continued, "about what you said, about remembering why I became a lawyer, about what leadership really means. And I think my father was right. Leadership isn't about making people work harder or achieve impossible standards. It's about making them better, helping them become the people they're meant to be." Rosie studied his face, searching for signs of manipulation or calculated charm. But all she saw was a man who looked like he'd been through hell and come out the other side changed. "What are you saying, Wagner?" "I'm saying you made me remember who I used to be, who I wanted to be before I got lost in the pursuit of success." His steel blue eyes were intense, vulnerable in a way that made her breath catch. "I'm saying you're the strongest, most principled person I've ever met, and watching you sacrifice everything for your beliefs made me realize I didn't even know what my beliefs were anymore." The words settled between them like a confession, raw and honest and terrifying in their implications. "I'm also saying," Wagner continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that I've fallen in love with you. Completely, irrevocably, inappropriately in love with you. And I know I have no right to tell you that. No, I've forfeited any claim to your trust or affection. But I needed you to know." Rosie's world tilted sideways. "Wagner, I don't expect anything," he said quickly. "I know I've hurt you, betrayed your trust, made choices that you can't forgive. But I needed you to know that watching you walk out of my office was the worst moment of my life. Not because you'd exposed the truth, but because I'd lost you. Because my cowardice and moral bankruptcy had driven away the best thing that had ever happened to me." Tears were flowing freely down Rosie's cheeks now, her carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of his honesty. "You destroyed evidence," she whispered. "You let innocent families suffer for corporate profit." "I did, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that." Wagner's hand moved toward hers, then stopped, respecting the distance she needed. "The families are getting their settlement, by the way. $23 million plus medical monitoring and property cleanup. It's not enough, will never be enough, but it's something. That doesn't absolve you. I know, nothing can, but maybe I can learn to be the man you saw in me at that cafe. The man who remembered why justice matters more than winning." Rosie closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of emotions warring in her chest. Love and hurt and hope and fear all tangled together until she couldn't tell where one ended and another began. "I don't know how to trust you again," she admitted. Then, "Don't, not yet." Wagner's voice was gentle, patient in a way that reminded her of their lunch conversation. "Let me earn it back. Let me prove that the man you glimpsed between the lawyer and the executive is real. How? However you'll let me, whatever it takes." Rosie opened her eyes and found him watching her with an expression so open, so vulnerable, that it took her breath away. This wasn't the Wagner Bosch who'd terrorized junior associates with impossible standards. This was just Wagner, flawed, lost, but trying to find his way back to something resembling honor. "I'm unemployed," she said finally. "Blacklisted, living on unemployment benefits and prayer. So am I. We'll figure it out. I might have to move back in with my parents. I already called my brother. He says I can sleep on his couch in Atlanta. Until I find something." "This is insane," Rosie said, but she was almost smiling through her tears. "Completely," Wagner agreed, "but maybe insane is better than the alternative. Maybe insane is the only way to build something real from the wreckage we've made." Rosie looked at him, really looked, and saw past the expensive suit and executive polish to the man underneath. Broken, uncertain, but trying to be better. Trying to be worthy of the love he'd confessed. "I can't promise anything," she said quietly. "I can't promise I'll forgive you, or that this will work, or that we won't destroy each other trying." "I'm not asking for promises," Wagner replied. "I'm asking for a chance." The rain had stopped while they talked, and afternoon sunlight was beginning to break through the clouds, casting everything in golden relief. Rosie thought about the long, uncertain road ahead, job searches and student loans, and the daily work of rebuilding trust. It would be hard, maybe impossible, but sitting in her car with Wagner beside her, both of them stripped of pretense and armor, she thought maybe impossible wasn't the same as hopeless. "One chance," she said finally, "and if you lie to me again, if you choose the easy path over the right one, if you forget who you promised to be, you'll leave and I'll deserve it," Wagner finished. "I know." Rosie nodded, then did something that surprised them both. She reached across the console and took his hand, their fingers interlacing like a promise neither was quite ready to speak aloud. "So," she said, looking through the windshield at the cafe where everything had started, "what do we do now?" Wagner squeezed her hand gently, and when she looked at him, she saw hope flickering in his steel-blue eyes like sunlight through storm. "Clouds now," he said. "We figure it out together." 6 months later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of the small storefront office in Richmond's Fan District, illuminating dust motes that danced like hope made visible. Rosie stood in the center of the empty space, her dark eyes bright with possibility as she surveyed what would soon become Coleman and Associates, a legal aid practice focused on environmental justice and corporate accountability. Her hair was shorter now, cut in a sleek bob that framed her face and made her look older, more confident. The expensive blazers had been replaced by comfortable jeans and a soft blue sweater, clothes that spoke of someone who'd learned to prioritize authenticity over appearance. She no longer bit her nails, a habit that had disappeared along with the constant anxiety of trying to be someone else's version of perfect. "The lease is signed," Wagner said from behind her, and she turned to find him holding 2 steaming coffee cups from the cafe down the street. He looked different too, relaxed in a way she'd never seen during their Morrison and Associates days. His hair had grown out slightly, softening the sharp edges of his face, and he'd traded his intimidating suits for khakis and a button-down shirt that made him seem approachable, human. "Thank you," she said, accepting the coffee and breathing in the familiar aroma. "For the coffee and for everything else." The everything else encompassed 6 months of patient rebuilding, trust earned in small increments, love growing slowly from the ashes of their professional relationship. Wagner had kept his promise to prove himself, taking a position with a small civil rights firm in Atlanta, while Rosie worked to establish her practice in Richmond. The distance had been difficult, but it had also given them space to heal, to figure out who they were as individuals before trying to build something together. "I still can't believe you're doing this," Wagner said, moving to stand beside her as they both looked out at the busy street beyond their windows. Starting your own practice, taking on the system single-handedly. Not single-handedly, Rosie corrected, bumping his shoulder with hers. I've got help now. It was true. In the month since the Morrison scandal, Rosie had discovered she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. Carmen Velasco from Legal Aid had offered mentorship and referrals. 3 other attorneys who'd grown disillusioned with corporate law had reached out about joining her practice. Even Troy McKenzie had quietly sent her client referrals, unable to leave Morrison and Associates himself, but willing to support her mission however he could. Most surprisingly, several of the families from the Morrison case had become advocates, spreading word about the young lawyer who'd sacrificed her career to ensure they received justice. Their gratitude had been overwhelming, transforming Rosie's career suicide into something that looked increasingly like resurrection. Speaking of help, Wagner said, his voice carrying a note of nervous anticipation, I have something to tell you. Rosie turned to face him fully, noting the way he was fidgeting with his coffee cup, a tell she'd learned to recognize during their slow rebuilding process. The civil rights firm in Atlanta offered me a permanent position, he continued. Senior, associate with a partnership track. It's good money, great benefits, everything I thought I wanted. That's wonderful, Rosie said, though something in his tone made her stomach clench with unspoken dread. I turned it down. The words hung in the air between them like a question mark. You... What? Why? Wagner set down his coffee and moved closer, his steel blue eyes intense with the kind of focus that had once intimidated her, but now made her feel like the most important person in the world. Because, he said quietly, 6 months ago a brilliant, principled woman taught me that some things are more important than career advancement, like integrity, like justice, like love. Rosie's heart began to race as Wagner reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded document. What is that? A partnership agreement, he said, offering her the papers, for Coleman and Bosch attorneys at law, specializing in environmental justice, corporate accountability, and taking on cases that other firms won't touch because they're too difficult or too dangerous or too right. Rosie stared at the document, her hands trembling slightly as she read the terms. It was generous to the point of being absurd. Wagner would provide the majority of startup capital while taking an equal partnership stake, essentially bankrolling her dream while asking for nothing but the chance to be part of it. This is too much, she whispered. I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything, Wagner interrupted gently. I'm asking for the privilege of working alongside the woman who reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. I'm asking for the chance to build something meaningful instead of just profitable. Tears pricked at Rosie's eyes as she looked up at him. Are you sure? This won't be Morrison and Associates. We'll be taking on corporations with unlimited resources, fighting cases that other lawyers won't touch. We'll probably lose more than we win, at least at first. Good, Wagner said, and his smile was warm enough to light up the entire empty office. I'm tired of winning the wrong battles. Rosie set the partnership agreement aside and stepped closer to him, close enough to see the love and hope and determination in his expression. This is crazy, she said softly. Completely, Wagner agreed, his hands coming up to frame her face with gentle reverence. But I'd rather be crazy with you than sane without you. When he kissed her, it was soft and sweet and full of promises about the future they were building together. Not the polished, strategic future Wagner had once planned, but something messier and more authentic and infinitely more valuable. They broke apart when the sound of someone clearing their throat echoed through the office. Rosie looked over Wagner's shoulder to see Nia standing in the doorway, her arms crossed and a knowing smirk on her face. Well, well, Nia said, her voice rich with amusement. I come to help my girl set up her new office, and I find her making out with her former boss. Should I be concerned about the professional environment here? Nia, Rosie laughed, wiping at her eyes as she moved to hug her best friend. You're early. Traffic was light, Nia replied, returning the embrace before turning to study Wagner, with the calculating gaze of a protective sister. Mr. Bosch, I hear you've turned over a new leaf. I'm trying, Wagner said simply. Your friend is an excellent teacher. She is, Nia agreed, and she deserves someone who appreciates that, someone who won't let her down. I won't, Wagner promised, and something in his tone made Nia nod with grudging approval. Good, because if you do, I know where you live now. As the three of them spent the morning planning the layout of the new office, Rosie's workspace by the windows, Wagner's desk positioned where he could see both the street and Rosie, a small conference room for client meetings, Rosie felt something she hadn't experienced in months, pure, uncomplicated happiness. Her phone buzzed with a notification, and she glanced down to see a news alert. Morrison Industries agrees to $50 million additional settlement in groundwater contamination. Case more good news? Wagner asked, noticing her expression. The Morrison families are getting another settlement, she said, showing him the screen. Apparently, our little evidence disclosure opened up avenues for additional claims. Your evidence disclosure, Wagner corrected. I may have been forced to confront my conscience, but you're the one who had the courage to act on yours. As the day progressed, the empty office began to transform. Nia directed the placement of furniture with the authority of someone who'd clearly missed her calling as an interior designer. Wagner assembled bookshelves with the methodical precision that had once made him such a formidable opponent in contract negotiations. And Rosie sat at her new desk, looking out at the street where ordinary people went about their daily lives, many of them unaware that they now had advocates who would fight for them regardless of their ability to pay exorbitant legal fees. That afternoon, as the sun slanted through the windows and painted everything golden, Rosie found herself alone in the office for a few minutes while Wagner and Nia went to pick up dinner. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera app, just as she had that night 6 months ago when everything had started to unravel. But this time, when she pressed record, her voice was steady and strong. My name is Rosie Amara Coleman, she said to the camera, and 6 months ago I made a choice that cost me everything I thought I wanted. I lost my job, my financial security, my carefully planned career trajectory. She paused, looking around the office that represented her new beginning. But I gained something infinitely more valuable. I gained my integrity back. I gained the love of a man who was brave enough to change, and I gained the chance to practice law the way it was meant to be practiced, in service of justice, not profit. She ended the recording and immediately posted it to her newly created LinkedIn profile, adding a caption, Coleman and Bosch, attorneys at law. Opening soon. Because everyone deserves fierce advocates regardless of their bank account. Within hours, the post had dozens of likes and comments from fellow attorneys, potential clients, and supporters who'd followed her story. But the response that meant the most came from an unexpected source, a private message from Margaret, the former office manager at Morrison & Associates. Miss Coleman, the message read, I wanted you to know that what you did took real courage. I've been working in law firms for 23 years, and I've never seen anyone stand up for what's right the way you did. I'm retiring next month, but if you ever need an experienced office manager who believes in your mission, I'd be honored to work for you. Rosie was still staring at the message, tears streaming down her face, when Wagner and Nia returned with bags of Thai food. What's wrong? Wagner asked immediately, setting down the food and moving to her side. Nothing, Rosie said, showing him Margaret's message. Everything's perfect. As they sat on the floor of their new office, eating pad thai with plastic forks and planning their first cases, Rosie felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The road ahead would be challenging. Starting a practice was never easy, and taking on corporate giants with unlimited resources would be even harder. But they would face those challenges together, armed with passion and principle, and the kind of love that had been forged in fire and tested by truth. Her phone buzzed with one final notification of the day, a text from her mother. Saw your post, baby girl. Your father and I are so proud. This is who we raised you to be. Rosie smiled and leaned against Wagner's shoulder as they watched the sun set over Richmond through their office windows. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new challenges, new opportunities to fight for justice. But tonight, surrounded by the people she loved most and the dreams they were building together, Rosie Amara Coleman was exactly where she belonged. The video that had started as a moment of frustrated despair had become the catalyst for everything beautiful in her life. Sometimes, she thought, the best things came from the worst moments. You just had to be brave enough to see the possibilities hidden in the pain. Outside their window, the city hummed with life and possibility. And inside their small office, two lawyers who'd lost everything and found each other began planning how to change the world, one case at a time. What would you have done in Rosie's position? Would you have risked everything for strangers, or would you have chosen the safer path? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear about the moments when you've had to choose between what's easy and what's right. Your participation in this channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.